They handed me a manila envelope on a Tuesday morning. No ceremony, no explanation. Just a name handwritten on the outside, in ink that had faded to the color of rust. My name. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a legal notice, a property deed, and an address I had never seen in my life. 300 acres, somewhere in a county I had to look up on a map. I was 22 years old. I had $47 in my account. I had a backpack with 2 changes of clothes, a broken phone charger, and exactly nowhere to sleep that weekend. And somehow, I had just inherited a piece of land the size of a small town. What I found when I got there? I am still not sure I have the words for it. If you've ever been told you don't belong anywhere, if you've ever started with nothing and wondered if you were worth anything, stay with me. This story is for you. Subscribe before we go further, because what I found on those 300 acres changed more than my address. It changed everything I thought I knew about where I came from. My name is Marcus. I grew up in the Dunway house. That's what the kids called it. It wasn't a home. It was a building. Old brick, leaky pipes, windows that fogged in October and didn't clear until April. I was left there when I was 4 years old. No note, no explanation. My mother's name was on my file. My father's space was blank. I grew up in a room with 5 other boys, 3 sets of bunk beds, 1 window that faced a brick wall. The radiator knocked every night at 2 a.m. like it was reminding you that even the building had somewhere to be. I aged out of the system at 18. They gave me a bus pass, a $200 stipend, and a pamphlet called Starting Fresh. I remember reading it on the bus and thinking, this isn't starting fresh, this is starting from nothing. There is a difference. For 4 years, I moved between rented rooms, couch situations, shelter beds. I worked construction. I washed dishes. I did 2 winters at a warehouse outside the city, the kind of work that starts at 4 a.m. and leaves your hands so cold you can't open a jar at dinner. I didn't complain. Complaining was a luxury I couldn't afford. But I was tired, in the way that isn't about sleep. The kind of tired that settles in your chest when you've been alone a long time and you've started to wonder if that's just the shape of your life. The envelope came through the mail service that forwarded things from the youth services office. The caseworker, a woman named Patricia who I had not spoken to in 3 years, had tracked down my current address and sent it along. There was a sticky note on the outside in her handwriting. Marcus, this came through probate. Looks like it's real. Call a lawyer before you do anything. I didn't have a lawyer. I barely had a phone plan. I read the document 3 times standing in the hallway of the house where I rented a room. $14 a night, shared bathroom, 1 rule, no guests after 9 p.m. The deed said 312 acres, Harlan County. The name on the previous title was a man named Raymond Earl Gideon. I had never heard that name in my life, but according to the document, he had listed me by name, by birth date, by my case file number, as the sole heir to everything he owned. Raymond Earl Gideon had died 6 months earlier, alone, in a farmhouse on that land, and I had no idea who he was. I borrowed a truck from a man I worked with named Dell. He didn't ask many questions. He just tossed me the keys and said, "Bring it back with gas." I drove 6 hours south. November. The trees had already gone bare. The sky was the color of old nickels. The road started as highway, became county route, became gravel, and then became something that didn't have a name anymore, just 2 tire tracks pressed into the earth, edged with dead grass and cedar posts. I followed the address on the document, and when I got out of the truck, I just stood there. The farmhouse was still standing, barely. The porch had sagged on one side like a shoulder that had given up holding up its weight. The windows were intact, but filmed with years of dust. The front door was unlocked, not forced, just left open, like whoever lived there last had stepped out intending to come back.
Inside smelled of cedar and iron, and something underneath both of those things, something I couldn't name. There was a wood stove, a kitchen table with one chair, a shelf of canned goods, the labels faded, a coat on a hook by the door, heavy canvas, the kind of coat a working man wears. I touched the sleeve and it was still stiff with old dried mud. He had lived here, really lived here, alone. I walked through every room. The bedroom had a single cot, a Bible on the nightstand, and a photograph tacked on the wall above the bed. I leaned in to look at it, and I stopped breathing.
It was a woman, young, maybe 19 or 20, standing in front of what looked like a roadside diner, squinting against sun, one hand raised to shade her eyes. She had my nose, my jaw, my hands. On the back of the photograph, written in the same ink as my case file, Clara, 1998. My mother's name was Clara. I sat down on the floor of that farmhouse, right there, on cold, bare wood, and I didn't move for a long time. I could have walked away, sold the land, whatever it would bring, and gone back to the city, back to rented rooms and 4 a.m. shifts, and the particular kind of invisibility that comes from having no address that means anything. But I couldn't. Not yet. Not before I understood what this place was. I drove back to get my things. It didn't take long. I owned very little. I came back with my backpack, a sleeping bag, $230 in cash, and no plan. The nearest town was 11 miles away. Population, about 800. One gas station, one diner, one hardware store, a church that had been converted from a feed supply building. I would figure it out. I always had. The house needed work that I couldn't fully assess until I'd lived in it for a few days. The roof had 2 soft spots. The porch beam on the right side had split, not failed, but close. The water came in brown from the tap for the first 40 seconds every morning, and then ran clear. The wood stove worked. That was the most important thing. I chopped wood from a fallen cedar at the edge of the tree line. My hands blistered by the 2nd day. By the 4th day, the blisters had popped and hardened to callus, and I kept chopping. I ate from the canned goods on the shelf. Beans, creamed corn, a jar of something I couldn't identify that turned out to be pickled okra. I bought eggs and bread and instant coffee from the gas station in town. At night, I lay in my sleeping bag on the old man's cot and listened to the land. It is not quiet land like that. The wind moves through the cedar differently than it moves through city streets. Animals move at the edge of the field. Owls, something larger once that I didn't look for. I began to find my way around the property. 312 acres is bigger than your mind can hold at first. You have to walk it. I started walking every morning before the light fully came. East first, because that's where the sun appeared. A meadow that had been pasture once, I could tell by the remnants of fencing, old wire stapled to posts that were tilting into the grass. And then a creek that ran cold and clear even in November, cutting through a stand of hardwood, walnut and hickory and old-growth oak. And then, on the 4th morning, I found the barn. It was set back from everything else, behind a ridge that hid it from the house. Old, much older than the farmhouse, built from timber that had darkened to near black with age, the boards hand-cut and irregular in a way that machines don't make. The doors were chained, heavy iron links, old but not rusted through, padlocked. I went back to the farmhouse, looked through the old man's things with more intention now. In a coffee can on the shelf above the wood stove, behind a box of matches and a coil of baling wire, was a single key. It fit. The doors swung open, and the smell hit me first. Old wood, dry hay, engine oil, and underneath all of that, something like paper. Old paper. The smell of things written down and kept. The barn was full, not with equipment, not with feed or tools, though there were those too along the walls. Along the back wall, from floor to the first beam, stacked in wooden crates and wrapped in oilcloth, were boxes. Dozens of them, each one labeled in the same faded handwriting I'd seen on the photograph, the same hand that had written my name on the deed. I opened the first one. Letters. Hundreds of letters, all addressed to the same name, Clara Gideon. I want to pause here for a second, because if you had walked into that barn, if you had found hundreds of letters addressed to someone who shared your blood, written by a man you'd never met, what would you have done? Would you read them? Would you walk away? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know, because what I decided to do next changed everything that came after. I read them all. Not in one sitting, by lantern light and wood stove heat, my coffee going cold beside me, the wind pressing against the house. Raymond Earl Gideon was my grandfather. Clara was his daughter. She had left this place at 17. A fight, the letters described it without dwelling on it, the way men of a certain generation describe pain, obliquely, through its aftermath. She had left. He had spent 20 years trying to find her, writing letters to addresses he found through old friends and second-hand information. Most were never sent. Some came back unopened. A few had been answered. She had written back 3 times. The last letter was dated 2 years before I was born. She told him she was pregnant. She told him she was scared. She told him she would try to come back. She never did. There was a 4th letter in the bundle, written in a different hand, official, formal, a social services notification, the kind they send as a matter of record. It told Raymond
Earl Gideon that his daughter, Clara, had died, that she had left behind a child, a son, placed in foster care, that the child was healthy. I don't know what Raymond did in the days after that letter arrived, but some time after he had amended his will, and 22 years later that will had found me. I was not the only one who knew about the land. A man named Terrell Vance came to the property on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after I arrived. He drove a silver pickup, clean, and wore the kind of boots that have never worked a day. He introduced himself as a land buyer, local developer, said the property had been on their radar for a while. "We've had our eye on this acreage," he said, standing on the sagged porch, looking out at the fields like he was already calculating. "Raymond was never going to develop it, but there's real value here, mineral rights alone." He offered me $80,000, cash, fast close. He had papers in his truck. I told him I wasn't selling. He smiled the way men smile when they believe patience is just a tactic. "Think about it," he said. "Young man like you, no history here, no reason to carry all this. This much land is a burden, not a gift." He left, but not for good. 2 weeks later, I received a letter from a law firm. It claimed that Raymond's estate had a lien against it, an unpaid debt from a business arrangement 15 years prior. The letter suggested the debt exceeded the property's value. The letter suggested I consult a lawyer. It was signed by a firm with Vance's name in the address line as the referring client. I didn't have a lawyer, but I had something that mattered more right then. I had the letters, and I had started to understand what this land was worth, not in dollars. There was a woman in town named Evelyn Marsh, 81 years old, lived 2 houses down from the church. She had known Raymond Gideon for 60 years. When I knocked on her door and told her who I was, she looked at me for a long moment and then said, "You've got Clara's eyes." She let me in. She told me things the letters hadn't said. Raymond had been a careful man, a quiet man, a man who made no enemies easily, but had made a few hard ones over the years when he refused to sell or partner or yield on things he believed in. The Vance family had wanted that land for 20 years. There had been offers, there had been pressure. There had, she said, in a voice that dropped to something just above a whisper, been a fire in Raymond's equipment shed 7 years ago that no one could prove wasn't an accident. Raymond had never buckled. He always said, Evelyn told me, folding her hands in her lap, land doesn't belong to you. You belong to it. You just keep it for the next one. I drove back to the farm in the dark. I sat at the kitchen table, the lantern on, the letters stacked beside me. I thought about Raymond alone in this house for 20 years, writing letters no one answered, carrying a grief he never talked about, keeping this land intact, keeping it whole, keeping it for someone he had never met and didn't know was alive. And then I thought about who I was. Aged out of the system, $47, nowhere to sleep, and this. All of this. I found a lawyer. Her name was Delphine Okafor. She worked out of a shared office space in the county seat. She had a reputation for taking cases other lawyers wouldn't. She looked at the lien claim for 40 minutes, then she put it down on her desk and looked at me. "This is old," she said, "and it's not clean." The supposed debt was from a verbal agreement, no contract, no written terms, no recorded transaction. The firm's filing was within the statute of limitations by 11 days. Convenient. "It's trying to push you out before you get settled," she said. "It's pressure, not law, but pressure works on people who don't fight back." "I have to fight back," I said it plainly, without bravado. "You have to fight smart," she said. She filed a counter-response within the week. Then something unexpected happened. The lien was withdrawn. No explanation, no communication from the firm. It was just gone. Delphine said it meant they'd tested me and found resistance. It didn't mean they were gone. It meant they were recalculating. "Stay visible," she told me. "Get to know the county. Make it hard to make you invisible." Winter gave way to something softer. I fixed the porch beam. Took me a week to source the right timber and 2 days to do it properly, with help from a man named Abel who ran the hardware store and who came out one Saturday because he said he'd always meant to come see how Raymond was getting on and never had. Abel was 63. He worked beside me without talking much. At the end of the day, he shook my hand and said, "Raymond would have liked you." I didn't know what to say to that. I said, "I'm trying to deserve it." Spring came and the fields woke up. Grass came in green and thick in the old pasture. The creek ran high and fast with melt. The tree line filled in with new leaves, and the whole property went from a November sketch to something that felt alive.
I began to understand what I had. The land was old-growth timber in places, walnut and hickory that a timber company would pay serious money for, but sustainably harvested, not clear-cut. There was a spring-fed pond I found in March, hidden in a bowl behind the walnut stand. The water was cold and clear, and the bank was thick with watercress. There was a natural spring. Raymond had known about it. The letters referenced it once. He called it the good water, matter-of-factly, the way a man names something he has depended on for a long time. I had the spring tested. It was clean, better than clean. I am not going to tell you that everything suddenly became easy. It didn't. I worked harder that spring than I have ever worked in my life. 14-hour days, learning what I didn't know, making mistakes that cost me time and money I didn't have extra of. Fencing, drainage, a new roof section, learning to read the land the way Raymond must have learned to read it, slowly, season by season, until it started to make sense. In the spring, I found one more thing in the barn. Behind the last stack of crates, wrapped in canvas and tied with baling twine, was a leather-bound journal. Raymond's handwriting, 60 years of entries, not diary entries, not feelings and reflections, practical notes, soil conditions, planting records, weather logs, animal observations, spring locations, timber age estimates, property boundaries and their disputes, and at the back, a section written in a different kind of entry, slower, more deliberate, dated to the last 2 years of his life. He wrote about me, not personally, he had never met me, but abstractly. He wrote about what he hoped for whoever received this land, what he hoped they would understand, what he hoped they would protect. This land has been in trouble before, and it will be in trouble again. Trouble is not a reason to leave. Trouble is the test of whether you belong here. I never found my daughter, but I believe the land will find who needs it. That is how things work if you let them. I read that passage standing in the open barn door, spring light behind me, the fields stretching out. A man I never knew had spent 20 years keeping this place safe from me. He hadn't known my name, he hadn't known my face, but he believed I was coming. By summer, the farmhouse was livable in a way it hadn't been in years. The porch was level, the roof held, the water ran clear from the first turn of the tap. I had made contact with a conservation land trust, an organization that worked with private landowners to protect old-growth timber and waterways. They came out in June, 2 biologists, a land assessor, and a woman named Dr. Faye Callum, who studied spring-fed watersheds. Dr. Callum stood at the edge of the spring pond for a long time without speaking. Then she turned to me and said, "Do you understand what you have here?" The spring was feeding a watershed that connected to a protected river system. The land was a buffer zone, the kind of land that, if developed, would degrade the water quality for 3 counties downstream. Terrell Vance hadn't wanted the farmhouse. He hadn't wanted the timber. He had wanted the spring, the development rights, the ability to build on land that sat upstream from protected water. Raymond had known. Raymond had held. And now I held it. I entered into a conservation easement with the land trust in September. It meant the land could never be developed, not by me, not by anyone who came after. The timber could be sustainably harvested, a modest income. The spring was protected in perpetuity. In exchange, the trust helped fund the farmhouse restoration and provided a land stewardship stipend, enough to live simply and work the land. Terrell Vance sent one final letter. I didn't open it. I used it to start the wood stove. I live on the land my grandfather kept for me. I am 23 years old.
I wake up in November darkness and split wood before the sun comes. The radiator doesn't knock here. There is no radiator. There is a wood stove, and I know how to feed it, and the house holds its heat. I know the creek by the sound it makes in different seasons. I know where the walnut trees are oldest. I know where the spring comes up cold through the clay and runs clear even in August drought. I know what my grandfather's handwriting looks like. I know that my mother stood in front of a roadside diner in 1998 and squinted into the sun, and she had my hands. I know that some griefs do not resolve. They just find their place, a room inside you that you stop fighting to keep locked. I know what the Dunway house smelled like in February. I know what it is to have nowhere to sleep. I know what $47 feels like when it's everything you own. And I know this. The moment I opened that envelope in the hallway, I almost didn't. I almost threw away. Official mail meant bills or summons or bad news. I had trained myself not to open things like that. But something made me open it. I don't know what to call that something, but I am grateful for it every single morning. I kept the photograph, the one of my mother, Clara, 1998. It hangs in the same place Raymond kept it, above the bed. I look at it every morning when I wake up.
Sometimes I talk to it. I don't know if that's strange. I don't particularly care. I tell her about the land, about the spring, about the walnut trees that are older than anyone I've ever met, about Evelyn, who brings food sometimes and sits on the porch and talks about Raymond like he just stepped out for a minute. I tell her that her father kept this place, that he kept it for her and then kept it for me, that I am going to keep it for whoever comes after. They tell children in the system that the world is hard and you need to toughen up. They're not wrong. The world is hard. But toughening up is not the same as closing off. Raymond Gideon never hardened. He just held on, through loss, through grief, through 20 years of silence, through fires that weren't accidents and lawyers who filed things 11 days inside a deadline. He held on. And in holding on, he held something for me that I didn't know I needed. A place, a history, a name. That's what I found on those 300 acres. Not just land, not just a farmhouse or a spring or a conservation easement or a legal victory. I found that someone had kept me in mind. A stranger, my blood, a man who wrote letters no one answered for 20 years in a house at the end of a road with no name. He kept me in mind, and I will keep him in mine for as long as I am here. This story is about more than land. It's about what gets kept for us even when we don't know anyone is keeping it. About the people who held things together quietly in the dark for someone they may never meet. I want to ask you something real. Is there something in your life, a person, a place, a moment of grace that arrived when you needed it most from somewhere you didn't expect? Tell me in the comments. Not great video. Tell me your version of the envelope in the hallway, the thing you almost didn't open. And if this story meant something to you, subscribe, share it with someone who needs it, because some stories aren't just stories. Some stories are maps. And maybe this one leads somewhere for you.